living La Vida low carb. This show is changing lives. We talking about your diet, trying to get you feeling right. Cut up them avocados, fry some eggs. Time to explore the longest running health podcast, hosted by Jimmy Moore. Time to give up the crappy garbage. We're getting into ketosis. Every day is a new step to your goal. Yeah, you're getting closer, motivated and focused. Don't stop, just go. Time to get inspiration from the Living La Vida Low Carb Show. Hey, the livinglowcarbshow.com. Woo!
Hey guys, and welcome into the Living La Vida Low Carb Show today. And on Tuesdays, you have noticed that I have been doing a lot of scientific studies with this brand new Instagram page that I call Jimmy Makes Science Simple. So head on over to Instagram, follow me at Jimmy Makes Science Simple. Makes it easy to find. So what I do is I find the newest research on mostly nutritional health stuff, a lot of low carb and keto stuff, and we talk about those studies. And sometimes I only read the abstract because that's all I have access to. So we post those short ones on YouTube, as well as on the Jimmy Makes Science Simple Instagram page. And then sometimes I get a longer one, and I usually go live on Instagram to do those. And so go follow Jimmy Makes Science Simple over on Instagram, and you won't miss any of those episodes. But today, this episode that you're watching right now, if you're watching it on Instagram, or you're watching it on YouTube, or you're listening to it on the podcast, this is something that has not aired anywhere else yet. I have a study that I want to go over, and it's the full study. And it's really, really fascinating if you're into low-carb diets and then the negative effects that come from eating a high-carb diet. So let's dive right into this today. This is a study published on May 28th, 2021 in the Journal of Nutrition. That's a pretty biggie. And so the only name I recognize from the researchers is this guy named Lawrence Appel, Appel. I've been online for 17 years, and I've seen his name many times looking at nutritional health research. I would not say he's a low-carb advocate, but he certainly put his name on a lot of studies where low-carb diets have shown to be beneficial and high-carb diets being negatively impacted. And so let's read the title of the paper. Higher carbohydrate amount and lower glycemic index increase hunger, diet satisfaction, and heartburn in overweight and obese adults in the Omnicarb randomized clinical trial. So randomized clinical trial is a big part of this because it's a really quality study, and we're going to get into the details of why it's quality here in just a moment. So as always, I will read from the abstract. So those of you new to scientific vernacular, the abstract is where they do a quick little Cliff's Notes overview of what the study was about, the conclusions that were made, and then they get into the deep dive into it. So let's look at the abstract. Background. The dietary approaches to stop hypertension, known as the DASH diet, is a high carbohydrate diet. It's highly recommended because of its cardiovascular risk benefits, yet adherence to the DASH diet remains persistently low. So one of the reasons they wanted to do this study was to find out why more people don't stay on the DASH diet. How subjective impressions of this diet contribute to the adherence has never been thoroughly explored. The Omnicarb trial, which compared DASH-style diets varying in glycemic index and carbohydrate amount, surveyed subjective impressions of such diets. So I love that they're doing this, that, okay, the DASH diet, which by the way is not only low fat, high carb, it's also salt free, and it's supposedly healthy. It's predicated on a lot of the basically conventional wisdom of what a healthy diet should be. And it's supposed to help people with cardiovascular risk. The problem is nobody can stay on it because they're starving usually, and we're going to see what they found here in a minute. So the objective of this study was to examine the effects of glycemic index, known as GI, and carbohydrate amounts on qualitative aspects of diet acceptability through secondary outcomes in this Omnicarb trial. I've not heard of this Omnicarb trial before this study, but apparently it's data that's there that then other researchers can pick at. So the methods in this trial, Omnicarb was a randomized crossover trial of 4 different DASH-styled diets. So they varied them by GI. So it looks like the highest carb one had over 65% carbohydrate, and the lowest carb one still had over 45% carbohydrate, which in absolute terms, for the carbohydrate amount, that's 40% compared with 58% of the calories coming from carbs. So they did this in overweight and obese people with a BMI over 25, and the total number of participants, 163. Participants consumed each diet in random order over 5-week periods, separated by a 2-week washout. So they absolutely got the effects of what the diet is that they did. At baseline and at the end of each of the feeding periods, participants rated their hunger, their diet satisfaction, and any gastrointestinal symptoms, things like diarrhea, loose stools, constipation, bloating, nausea, and heartburn. So the only flaw so far that I'm seeing in this study design is those are all subjective measures. So if they have a physical effect, they may be so used to these physical effects that they don't recognize it as an effect. So I'm assuming that the researchers made it clear, hey, look, even if this is familiar, we want you to tell us about it so that we can record it in the study. So what were the results? Participants' mean age was 52 years old. 52% of the participants were women, 51% were non-Hispanic Black, and 56% of them were clinically obese, meaning their BMI was over 30. Compared with the baseline, all of the intervention diets decreased heartburn. So that's interesting. But they also increased diarrhea and loose stools, which is not surprising with a higher carb diet. Also increased bloating, which again, we know from gut health, if fermentation in the gut takes place, which takes place when you eat a lot of carbohydrates, then the bloating exists. But did not significantly affect constipation or nausea. Compared with the lower carb diets, higher carb diets increased the hunger. Yeah, I could see that. We know why that happens. When insulin goes up, it raises those hunger hormones. Things like leptin kick in, and ghrelin, oh my gosh, that's the huge one that gets instigated by higher carb diets. But they also had increased diet satisfaction, which I find interesting because a lot of people say, well, I like higher carb because at least I can have a diversity in my diet, and that's one of the complaints they have about low-carb ketogenic diets and even carnivore diets is, I'm just so bored, I'm not satisfied. And so I think they liked the fact that they had the variety, but then they had all these physiological effects with bloating and some of the other things that they talked about, that they had an increase in diarrhea and the bloating and heartburn and hunger. Like, is the trade-off worth it that you had satisfaction in your diet? I don't think so. Give me a steak and no bloating and no heartburn, and I'm completely satisfied, I can assure you. They also increased their heartburn compared with lower GI diets. Higher GI diets did not affect hunger, decreased diet satisfaction, and did not affect heartburn. There were no between diet differences when it came to diarrhea, constipation, bloating, and nausea. So their conclusion in this study, although a higher carbohydrate amount in DASH-style diets can increase diet satisfaction for all the reasons we just talked about, that so-called variety people are looking for, it can also decrease satiety signals, increase heartburn in adults who have obesity and overweight. So this was a trial registered at clinicaltrials.gov, so you can go look this up, and it's out there. All right, let's get into the meat of the study so you can see how they got to all that conclusion. Really fascinating study. Really happy to be sharing this here today exclusively on the Livin' La Vida Low Carb Show. Thank you so much for listening on the podcast, or if you're watching this on YouTube or over on Instagram. We do a lot of these kind of videos and content where we read from, I say we, it's Jimmy Moore reads from studies, and then I give my commentary along the way. So Jimmy Makes Science Simple is the Instagram page. Go check that out. But let's get into the introduction of this study. Diet plays an important role in primary prevention for cardiovascular disease. That's true. Modifications to dietary carbohydrate intake are also important aspects of managing many chronic diseases, including things like obesity, diabetes, and hypertension or high blood pressure. The DASH diet has been shown to reduce blood pressure and cholesterol, which, blood pressure does go down, but it's not necessarily because of the diet. I think it's a little bit of the diet, but it's not specifically what's in the diet, but I think it's the lower calories. I think some of the other things that they apply there, there's a there that they help with, but it's an incomplete reason why that happens. And cholesterol, you guys know I could wax eloquently on why that's probably not a big issue, that it has an ability to reduce cholesterol. That's out of context. Such findings about these benefits of the DASH diet have led the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, as well as the American Heart Association, to rate the DASH diet as one of the best diets for cardiovascular disease prevention. Yes, every January, U.S. News and World Report comes out with a best diets of the year list. And the DASH diet almost invariably is at the top of all of those lists, and especially as it relates to cardiovascular disease. However, adherence to the DASH style diets has remained low nationally over many decades. Data from the 2001 to 2010 NHANES study showed that only 21.7% of adults who are over the age of 30 consumed a DASH diet. That's 1 in 5. That's crazy. And it also has been reported that compliance was worse for those with hypertension and obesity. They need to be asking themselves why. If the very people who stand to benefit the most, the obese and the people with high blood pressure, stand to benefit the most from this from a cardiovascular standpoint, why can't they comply? Why has nobody before this study ever asked that question? It's a very easy question to ask, and as you know from my work, very easy to explain why there would not be, why 80% go, I ain't eating that diet, Jimmy. And I don't blame you. One of the hypotheses for the low adherence could be diet palatability and gastrointestinal side effects caused by the DASH diet. And again, if they know there's gastrointestinal side effects, maybe there's something in the diet causing that gastrointestinal side effect. And why have we never picked at that scab before and tried to figure out what is it about that diet that's causing those problems? I'm glad they did this study, because at least we're now going to get answers to that. Further research is needed on how changes to the DASH dietary composition may improve compliance without reducing its beneficial effects on cardiometabolic risk factors. So they go into how carbohydrates are the principal source of calories in the DASH diet, which is true. Dietary carbohydrates are classified by quality, meaning the glycemic index, how fast specific foods raise blood glucose in the 2 hour after consumption. So that's the postprandial glucose response, and the amount of carbohydrates as a proportion of the daily calorie intake. Look, if somebody wants to eat a carb-based diet, that's fine, but you've got to know that comes with consequences. It's always been my concern with people who promote low-fat diets, because it's an ersatz high-carb diet. When you eat low-fat, you automatically have to eat high-carb. There is no in-between. Protein stays pretty constant in all the studies, maybe a little higher by like 5%, but you're not talking about raising protein by 40%. Whereas carbohydrate, you could raise by 40%, or if you go the ketogenic route, you could raise fat by 40% and lower carbohydrate. So they've never really looked at that before. Some studies have shown that lower carbohydrate amount and lower GI diets improve insulin sensitivity and thus increase weight loss. But there has not been consensus on what the qualitative effects of carbohydrate amount and qualities such as hunger, diet satisfaction, and gastrointestinal symptoms. Elucidation of these qualitative factors is essential to improving patient compliance with all the prescribed diets. So the Omnicarb study, which Omnicarb, they have this big long title. I'm going to try to read it to you. So Omnicarb, the effect of amount and type of dietary carbohydrates on risk of cardiovascular heart disease and diabetes study. So somehow they got all those words, and the short version is Omnicarb, O-M-N-I-C-A-R-B. What it did was it examined the impact of modifying carbohydrate GI and the carbohydrate amount in the context of sticking to the DASH-style diet over a 5-week period. They wanted to see what impact it would have on cardiovascular risk factors in people with obesity and overweight, as well as those who are non-diabetic. And that's key because we know that heart disease, diabetes, a lot of these kind of chronic diseases that people deal with, they're all the same disease. It's insulin resistance. I've said that many times before in my commentary. So it's good to remind yourself of that when they're looking at trying to prevent cardiovascular disease. If they have existing diabetes, their risk of having cardiovascular disease happen goes up exponentially. And so the fact that they're non-diabetic is key in this.
Keto Chow is a customizable shake mix that is also perfect for cooking and baking, giving you simple, nutritionally perfect meal options. Keto Chow. Make keto easy. Discover your favorite flavor at jimmylovesketochow.com.
In the Omnicarb study, all diets reduced blood pressure and LDL cholesterol compared with baseline. In this study of secondary outcomes, we assessed diet palatability and the acceptability by examining participants' responses to standardized questionnaires on hunger, diet satisfaction, and gastrointestinal symptoms, which again, all subjective things, but all important things to talk about in a study. We hypothesized that the lower GI diets and the lower carbohydrate diets would decrease hunger and increase diet satisfaction. As a low-carb advocate, I would say yes, you should see a decrease in your hunger and cravings, and you should see higher diet satisfaction. If you're choosing palatable foods that fit within a lower carb context, that makes sense. We also hypothesized that gastrointestinal symptoms such as bloating would increase on the intervention diets due to the higher fiber content of those eating the DASH-style diets compared with their baseline diet before they started the study. So let's take a look at the methods that they used for this study. Omnicarb was an investigator-initiated National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute-sponsored trial whose rationale, methods, and main results have all been published. In brief, Omnicarb was a randomized controlled crossover trial. Remember, crossover trial means they did one wing, they had a washout period, and then they went to the other wing, and then the ones that started with the other wing, then they had a washout period, and they went to the original. So that's what crossover means. They had 4 dietary intervention periods. Participants consumed 4 distinctive DASH-style diets in random order. A total of 8 distinctive diet sequences were selected based on the condition that higher GI and lower GI diets would be compared during those first 2 diets for everyone. Diet sequences were then stratified by study site so that they could ensure a balance of sequences at each site, and then block randomization was utilized to prevent predictability of sequence assignment. I love how these researchers try to craft a study to build in what would happen in a natural environment, because we're not all eating the same diet. We're not all changing diets to the same things all the time. We're always picking things all over the place. And so they're trying to mimic that with the way they design the study, letting them pick at random. Some never do diets that other ones do. And so it's interesting that they teased that out in the study and made it a part of it, because that's more real life than some clinical setting where they're trying to control everything. The 4 Omnicarb diets varied by glycemic index and carbohydrate intake. So they had a higher carb, higher GI, a higher carb, lower GI, a lower carb, higher GI, and a lower carb, lower GI. Those were the 4 categories. Estimated contents of the study diet nutrients were determined from food analysis. GI is a measure of carb quality, representing the amount of glucose released, blah, 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 blah. You guys know GI. It is determined by carrying the area under the glucose curve between 50 grams of carbs from a food of interest and 50 grams ingested glucose. Yeah, you guys know all that. Other than the difference in GI and carb amount, the 4 diets were pretty similar. Each diet was a healthful DASH-style diet that emphasized potassium-rich fruits and vegetables, low-fat dairy. It included whole grains, poultry, fish, and nuts, and was reduced in red meat, sweets, sugar-containing beverages. So, it's not ketogenic. And it's really not that low in carbs, but it's lower for a DASH-style diet. So keep this in mind, that as I'm talking about the effects of the high-carb diet that they found and the subjectiveness of what they felt when it came to hunger and other physiological effects, that what they did even in the lowest carb, lowest GI group still was a whole lot of carbs. Like, we're still talking 40-45% carbohydrate. But the point is that even that small little change produces pretty incredible results from what they've been pushing on people. Accordingly, each of the diets was rich in potassium, magnesium, calcium, and fiber, which are all good for electrolytes and other things. They were reduced in total fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol, which again goes by those guidelines for the DASH diet. It is a tried and true conventional wisdom, low-fat, high-carb diet. That's what the DASH diet is. Total calories and sodium intake were also similar in the 4 diets, which I told you, very low in sodium. That's one of the hallmarks of the DASH diet. You don't need to go that low in sodium, but they do. All right. So let's get into how they recruited the participants. Adult men and women who were over the age of 30 were recruited from Boston, Massachusetts, and Baltimore, Maryland. All of the participants had to have a BMI over 25. They also had to have a systolic blood pressure of 120 to 159. That's the top number. And a diastolic blood pressure of over 100. So they needed at least a 120 over 100, or at maximum a 159 over 100. Persons with a prior diagnosis of diabetes, chronic kidney disease, or cardiovascular disease, or those people who are taking medications for high blood pressure like diuretics, high cholesterol, or diabetes were all excluded. So remember, they're trying to make sure they don't have any confounding factors that these have, that these participants would have other comorbidities that would contribute to a basically throwing a monkey wrench into their study, because they're not trying to see what other diseases do for these people. They want to know, okay, you don't have anything except the one that we're trying to study. I love that they did that in this study. Participants were asked to refrain from taking any non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agents for 2 days prior to their blood draw, because they wanted to see where they actually stand. The institutional review boards at the Johns Hopkins University, Brigham and Women's Hospital, and the Harvard School of Public Health all approved the study protocol. Those are 3 institutions that are highly recognized as knowing what they're talking about when it comes to study design. So that's cool. All right, so let's look at the controlled feeding. Participant enrollment began in April of 2008. Feeding and data collection ended in December of 2010. Participants were randomly assigned to one of 8 dietary sequences of the 4 main diets, and they received 100% of their meals from each study center. So in other words, for the duration of this randomized trial, they got all their food provided by the study authors. Study participants underwent an 8-day run-in phase, during which each of the 4 study diets was given for 2 days. Afterwards, participants consumed each diet over a 5-week period, followed by a 2-week washout, during which they ate their self-selected diet. In other words, they don't have to follow the DASH diet. I wonder how many of them hated the protocol they were on in the 5-week period, and they were just like, when I get to that 2 weeks, I'm just going to go binge on McDonald's. And they were probably so frustrated, especially the ones that had the hunger. Calorie targets were determined for each participant based on their body size, their sex, and their physical activity level. Calorie intake was adjusted throughout the trial to keep weight within 2% of their baseline. So that's interesting. They didn't want them gaining weight and they didn't want them losing weight. They had to stay within 2%. Isn't that fascinating? Attendance at the meals was recorded on the weekdays. Participants were required to eat one principal meal on site and were observed every time they ate. Can you imagine, like, you're sitting there eating your meal and somebody's just staring, writing notes, staring. Can you imagine they're eating the food and they're just like, ugh, if I have to eat one more bite of this crap, I'm going to puke. Sorry, I'm just imagining the scenario of being watched while you eat. Participants were sent home with the remaining 2 meals and their weekend meals. Every day, participants completed a diary in which they listed their consumption of the protocol and their non-protocol foods. All right, so how did they measure the symptoms that they were measuring in the study? They were asked at the end of the screening and run-in periods and at the end of each of the feeding periods. The questionnaire was similar to that used in previous feeding studies regarding the occurrence of symptoms during the past month, including diarrhea, loose stools, constipation, bloating, nausea, upset stomach, and heartburn. The 4 ordinal options for each symptom. So they had a number assigned to what level of symptom they had for each of these things. If it was 1, it didn't happen. If it was 2, it was only mild. If it was 3, it was moderate. And if it was 4, it was severe. Again, all of that is subjective, but they leave it up to the individual to tell you where they stand. The frequency of the symptoms was not asked. So they didn't want to know how often, how long did it happen. We just want to know, did it happen? And then if it happened, what number do you assign to it? How about the measurement of hunger and diet satisfaction? Participants were asked to rate how hungry they felt and how much they liked the diet regarding the food that they were provided over the past week at the end of each of the feeding periods. Hunger options ranged from 1 to 9, with 1 being not hungry at all and 9 being extremely hungry. Diet satisfaction ranged from 1 to 9, 1 being disliked extremely and 9 being liked extremely. These questions were not completed at baseline. So in other words, they didn't want to know like how happy they were with their chosen diet. They only wanted to know satisfaction and hunger for the intervention diet. All right, statistical analysis. The study population characteristics were evaluated using means and proportions. They evaluated all the effects of the diet on hunger, diet satisfaction, symptoms, compared responses from baseline and each of the 4 intervention diets between each of the intervention, blah, 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 blah. This is a little bit boring, so I'm going to skip over a little bit. Because this study was a randomized crossover trial and missing data were relatively low per intervention group, all of the baseline characteristics should be controlled for inherently and no additional covariates were adjusted for in the regression models. That's a little bit of research speak. Don't get caught up in that. They're just trying to explain that we did our homework and we tried to make sure that all of the outcomes that we got were indeed what happened. All right, so what were the results? Let's dig into that. A total of 163 participants completed more than 2 of the 4 intervention diets, and they were included in the analysis. For any pair of diets, there were between 135 and 150 participants. Baseline characteristics of the randomized study population are shown in Table 1, which they have a nice little graphic for us there. And overall, the mean age of the participants was 52.1 years old, 52% women, 51% non-Hispanic Black, 56% of the study participants were obese, 26 of them had hypertension but not on medications for it. No differential baseline characteristics were detected between the participants that were included in the analysis and dropouts by diet. Overall, this was interesting, adherence was pretty high to these diets. 96% of them showed up for their in-person requirement to eat the 1 meal. That's interesting. Participants consumed all of the study foods with no non-study foods consumed. 96% of them did that. Any alcohol consumption was reported on 11% of people. So that's pretty low. Like if you got some boozers in the trial, maybe they would want to, unless they lied, I suppose. They could have lied. So let's look at the symptoms. The percentages positive, mild, severe, or moderate for the symptoms at the end of baseline and intervention periods are depicted in figures 1 and 2. So again, they got lots of figures. Figures don't like translate over podcasts, so I'm just gonna like keep reading the study because they talk about what they found. So the gastrointestinal symptoms comparing baseline and intervention diets also are in another table. Participants reported a decreased symptom of heartburn on all of the intervention diets compared with the baseline. Participants reported increases in diarrhea and loose stools and bloating on all intervention diets compared with their baseline. Lastly, participants reported no differences in constipation, nausea, upset stomach on all of the intervention diets compared with baseline. All right. So let's skip past all of those tables because you can get really caught up in the weeds with that. All right. Symptoms of diarrhea, loose stools, constipation, bloating, and nausea, upset stomach were not significantly different between the higher GI diets and lower GI diets, nor between higher carb diets and lower carb diets. Remember, lower carb means like 40-45% of carbs. Heartburn symptoms for the higher carb diets compared with low carb diets showed a slight increase, more heartburn on the high carb diets. Specifically, the higher carb, higher glycemic index diet showed significantly increased heartburn compared with the other diets, which again does not surprise me or any of us. All right. How about hunger? So they used a hunger rating, and again, they show it in a table as to how they found the hunger. Participants felt more hungry on the higher carb, higher glycemic index diet period, and less hungry following the lower carb, lower glycemic diet. Again, not surprising to us, but I'm sure the people that promote the DASH diet are going, whoa, no wonder we couldn't get 4 out of 5 people to do our diet. They're starving. Yeah, newsflash. You could have known that many years ago if you actually did the deep dive like Lawrence Apple and his team here are doing. Higher carb diets compared with lower carb diets showed an increase in hunger individually. They showed significantly higher hunger ratings as compared to the lower carb diets. There was no significant difference in hunger between the higher GI diets and the lower GI diets. So when they looked at that was interesting. However, the higher carb, higher GI had significantly, or lower, it's hard to keep up with all these little shorthands I'm trying to translate in my head. The lower carb, lower GI had significantly lower hunger ratings than both of the other diets. How about diet satisfaction? Participants liked the high carb, high GI diet more than they did the lower carb, high GI diet. So that's that. And I'm trying to dig into that. And plus they're trying to stay within the template of the DASH diet. The DASH diet is very low in fat. So when you lower carbs and you don't also increase fat, guess what? You're not going to be very satisfied. And so had they done this study and they compared the DASH diet, the very high carb, very high glycemic index, with like a more ketogenic styled type of diet, I think their satisfaction would have been a lot better with bacon, full fat foods, eggs, steak, that kind of thing. That would have made it more desirable. But they're still trying to fit it within the context of the DASH diet, and therefore they weren't very happy when they had to eat less carbs but still have the crappy rest of the diet. Whereas the people that ate the higher carb, at least they're like, woohoo, I'm eating lots of carbs. I'm satisfied. I love that. I'm hungry. I'm bloated. I'm not feeling well. Oh, but I'm happy because I'm satisfied having more carbs. Doesn't make sense, does it? You guys tried the Paleo Valley beef sticks? These beef sticks are 100% grass-fed and grass-finished. And many of the grass-fed beef sticks on the market today are actually finished with grains. They use beef sourced from small domestic farms in the United States. They only use real organic spices to flavor the beef sticks versus all the conventional spices sprayed with pesticides and other natural flavors from GMO. They also ferment the sticks, which creates naturally occurring probiotics, all great for your gut health. And best of all, they taste amazing. Again, they're Paleo Valley, my favorite beef stick on the market today. Go check them out, you guys. PaleoValley.com. Use the coupon code Jimmy at checkout for 15% off your first order. Paleo Valley beef sticks. So let's skip ahead the discussions. This is always where it's fun in a study, looking at the researchers discussing what they found. This study reports the effects of carbohydrate amount and GI on hunger, diet satisfaction, and gastrointestinal symptoms. Compared with the baseline, all DASH-style diets tested in the Omnicarb decreased heartburn symptoms while increasing diarrhea, loose stools, bloating symptoms. Participants recorded increased heartburn symptoms, increased hunger, and increased diet satisfaction on higher carbohydrate diets compared with lower carbohydrate diets. I wonder how many of those people that they had higher hunger, higher heartburn, but then greater satisfaction with the high carb diet. How many of them would keep it up because they were satisfied with the diet, but then they got the heartburn and they got the hunger? I don't know about you, but I'd rather have a diet that is less satisfying, but keeps hunger down, keeps heartburn down, and other cardiometabolic effects. To me, it's just silly. I mean, I suppose just the researchers were just noting, hey, they liked the diet, even though it was making them feel like shit. They liked the diet. Like, I wonder how many of them, if they asked them, would you keep doing this diet? And maybe later in the study they will reveal this, but I wonder how many of them will be like, yeah, I'll keep doing that because, man, I was satisfied in that diet, even though it gave me heartburn and indigestion and bloating and blah. It's fascinating. Participants also reported decreased hunger on the lower carb, lower GI diet compared to the other lower GI diets with the higher carb, and decreased diet satisfaction on higher GI diets compared with lower GI diets. These findings suggest that although a high carbohydrate amount in the DASH diet can increase diet satisfaction, it also decreases satiety and increases heartburn in those adults with obesity and who are overweight. We theorize that many of the changes in the gastrointestinal symptoms during the intervention diet compared with baseline diets were related to the general change from a typical American diet to the DASH-style diet. So that's interesting. They're saying, okay, you went from kind of a standard American diet, crappy garbage diet as I call it, to now going to a lower fat and higher carb, but probably lower than maybe they were eating in their standard diet. So that's funny that they think that's why they had the gastrointestinal issues. And, you know, quite frankly, those of us that go keto and carnivore, early on, you could have some gastrointestinal issues. A lot of that is gut microbiome die-off, and so that could cause some of those issues. It's interesting that that's their theory as to why that happened. They also said that the decreased heartburn could be due to the beneficial effect of nutrient-rich vegetable and fruits-focused diet and increased regularity of meal times. Increased bloating and diarrhea, loose stools could be due to related or misattributed symptoms from having more fiber in the intervention diet in the study. The bloating finding is congruent with the DASH sodium-controlled feeding trial, which showed that there was an increase in bloating on all DASH diet interventions compared with the control diet at all sodium levels. Conversely, these results could support the recommendation of DASH-style diets in adults with obesity and overweight to counteract the increased prevalence of constipation. Maybe. Or maybe just don't feed them the DASH diet and get them on a ketogenic carnivore diet would be awesome. They don't want to listen to me, though. The main between diet differences in gastrointestinal symptoms was increased heartburn when they ate high carbohydrate. One theory about that is the relation between large carbohydrate amounts and heartburn and gastroesophageal reflux disease, Gerd. Symptoms is that undigested carbohydrates cause increased fermentation in the digestive tract by gut bacteria, which then leads to the reflux. Yeah, no kidding. Dr. Eric Westman actually found that in some of his low-carb ketogenic trials. He found it spontaneously. They weren't even looking for impact on heartburn and Gerd. But what happened was people were spontaneously telling him in some of his studies, hey, look, I went on the diet and I used to have heartburn. I don't have heartburn anymore. It wasn't even one of the secondary outcomes that Dr. Westman was looking at, and yet they self-reported it so much that they had to put it in the study. So we've known about that for a little while. One intervention trial of 42 obese women with Gerd were prescribed a low-carb, high-fat diet, demonstrated resolution of all Gerd symptoms by the end of the 16-week period. That's Dr. Westman's study right there. And dietary simple carbohydrates was detected as the most strongly associated for those having Gerd. One small study of obese patients with Gerd showed significantly decreased time in low esophageal pH and improved symptom scores after going on a low carbohydrate diet, which in that study was defined as under 20 grams, which is a real low carb diet, not this 40 to 45% of your calories coming from carbs being low carb. Likewise, another small study showed significantly lower total reflux time and symptom scores when consuming low carb compared with high carb. Low carb defined as 85 grams in a day, high carb being 180 grams per meal, Although the current literature on the effects of carbohydrates of heartburn and Gerd remains limited, our results could further support that the beneficial effects of lower carb diets on Gerd is accurate. Our non-significant differences for the effect of GI on heartburn could indicate the importance of the amount of carbohydrates more so than the quality in overall heartburn symptoms being improved. Considering the increasing prevalence of Gerd in the United States, a lower carbohydrate diet might prove useful in alleviating symptoms, and it warrants further investigation. Well, that's good. That's a great conclusion, because most people spontaneously report that when they start eating low carb, heartburn goes away, Gerd goes away. That's good news. Our finding that more hunger was reported with high carb diets is consistent with the glucostatic theory, which posits that transient decreases in glucose in the blood will cause hunger, and transient increases in blood glucose will cause satiety. We previously reported on the oral glucose tolerance test, 1 hour blood glucose was higher during the low carb diet than the higher carb diet. This transiently higher glucose spike could explain at least partially why participants felt greater satiety when they ate low carbohydrate compared with high carbohydrate. Additionally, we cannot exclude the possibility that the lower carbohydrate diet decreased hunger due to an increase in protein and fat, which is true. When you lower carbs, there's only 2 other macros you can raise to make up for that lack of calories from the carbohydrates. Protein, which has the same number of calories as carbs per gram, or fat, which has just over twice as many calories. Many trials have shown that higher protein diets decrease hunger and increase satiety, including the Omnihart controlled feeding trial, which compared appetite and hormones related to appetite between diets with targeted increases of each of the major macronutrients, fat, protein, and carbohydrate. It could be important to consider a synergistic role of higher protein and low carb on diet satiety. Well, yeah, a lot of us are living that out, where we're doing better, and some of us not just higher protein, but also higher fat with very minimal carbohydrate. Short-term studies that examine changes in hunger between high GI diets and low GI diets have mainly reported increased or no significance in hunger on higher GI diets compared with lower GI diets. One short-term study in overweight women showed a decreased hunger on high GI diets compared to low GI diets. Some of the longer-term trials, in contrast, report no significant differences. However, many of the long-term diet interventions had considerably smaller sample sizes, only provided dietary recommendations in lieu of giving them actual food like they did in this study. They did not confirm that they actually ate the diet that they were prescribed, or they were part of a weight loss study where calorie deficits actually would influence the level of satiety. I love that they're pointing all this out, that in their study, they controlled all the food. They made sure they didn't lose or gain any weight. They kept their weight within 2% of baseline. Our study's non-significant difference in hunger between the higher GI diets combined and the lower GI diets combined, yet significant decrease in hunger on the low-carb, low-GI diet compared with the other contributes to the inconclusive results of the literature. However, given that higher GI foods have been shown to increase postprandial blood sugar and insulin levels compared with lower GI foods, it is possible that our results now remain consistent with this glucostatic theory in that higher GI diets result in greater satiety due to higher transient increases in blood glucose. These are still inconclusive findings regarding the influence of GI on hunger and indicate the need for more research to clarify the mechanism. Alrighty, the higher carb diets tested in the Omnicarb study, which garnered greater diet satisfaction scores compared with the lower carb diets, were similar in carbohydrate amount, the percentage of calories, to the original DASH diet. Remember, the original DASH diet is like 57 to 58%, and then they only lowered it into the 40s. I still contend they would have had more diet satisfaction if they lowered carbs significantly more and then replaced all those significantly less carbohydrates with more fat and protein. But even still, even in this very minor shift downward in the carbohydrate, they still saw a benefit. Which has always fascinated me when I've read these studies and I see they go to 40-45% carbohydrate compared to a 55-60% carbohydrate. Oh my gosh, look, they had better satiety, they had better blah, 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 blah. Doesn't that make you curious what it would be like if you lowered carbs more and you raised fat and protein more? To me, that's what good science would say. Wow, we got that effect with just that minimal change. What would it be like if they went, look, let's say they did a 30% carbohydrate diet. Just to go down from the 40-45, go down to 30. Still higher carb than I would be comfortable with in terms of trying to see what benefits ketosis, for example, would be providing. But I think their benefits would be even more. Their diet satisfaction couldn't help but be better than it was in this trial. A few studies have focused on diet satisfaction with lower GI diets. One short-term feeding study of adolescents with diabetes demonstrated similar diet satisfaction between the lower GI foods and standard foods with slightly lower but still acceptable ratings. Concurrently, other studies have also demonstrated positive effects of lower GI diets on weight loss and metabolic parameters. Our study did have a few limitations, and I love when they put this in the study. So some of the limitations that they self-identify, they only used one 9-point question to qualify hunger, as well as one 9-point question to qualify diet satisfaction, instead of doing multiple questions relating to satiety with the diet and satisfaction on a visual analog scale in comparison with other studies. So other studies, they have different ways of measuring this kind of subjectiveness when it comes to hunger and diet satisfaction. They only did one, and they're self-admitting they probably should have diversified that a bit. Although this probably limits our sensitivity and reliability of the data that we found, we believe the trends in our results are still indicative and congruent with all the current literature. Additionally, the long-term effects of these diets remain undetermined. Remember, they only did 5-week protocols of each of the 4 diets with a 2-week washout in between. And the generalization of this controlled feeding trial to normal environmental conditions could be limited as well. Various errors are possibly due to testing of multiple outcomes and the presence of dropouts with each diet. 92% plus of the participants completed at least one of the intervention diets, and the results between specific dietary groups and pooled dietary groups generally demonstrated a congruent, more robust outcome. Finally, there is a risk of carryover effects, although this was minimized when they did 2 weeks washout. They didn't want any carryover. 2 weeks is a good amount of time between dietary interventions before you go to the next one. Initial analyses for carryover effects between diet periods and major outcomes were not really statistically significant. Nevertheless, they do outline their strengths in the study, so let's see what they think the strengths were and see if I agree. This study was a carefully designed, randomized controlled trial involving standardized questionnaires in an overweight and obese population without diabetes who were not taking glucose-altering medications. That is a bonus, all of that. Furthermore, this study was a crossover trial that reduced the influence of any confounding variables. Few participants were lost because of follow-up. Another bonus, I agree. As a feeding study, composition was highly regulated in comparison with behavioral intervention studies, and participant compliance with the intervention remained high throughout the study. Kudos to them, because a lot of these diet studies, they don't get anywhere near like 90-something percent compliance. They get a lot of dropouts, especially with a study of this type where they already know people don't like the high-carb, high-GI DASH diet, as evidenced by the statistics that showed only 1 in 5 stay on it. So the fact that they had such high compliance was a good thing. In contrast to other long-term studies that measure diet satisfaction and hunger via controlled weight loss and calorie deficit dietary interventions, our study was isocaloric, therefore tested the effects of diet composition without any confounding effects on the weight. To conclude, in this 5-week controlled feeding study of overweight and obese adults, diets with a higher proportion of carbs were associated with increased heartburn symptoms, increased hunger, and increased diet satisfaction. Diets with a higher GI were associated with decreased hunger and decreased diet satisfaction. All of these findings suggest that although high carb amounts in DASH-style diets can increase diet satisfaction, it can also decrease satiety and increase heartburn in those who are overweight and obese. So that's the study, you guys. Again, it was funded by a grant from the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and it was reported and supported the publication in the Mid-Atlantic Nutrition Obesity Research Center. Got an NIH award for doing the study, and yeah. So again, go look it up if you want to check it out. The title of the paper, Higher Carbohydrate Amount and Lower Glycemic Index Increase Hunger, Diet Satisfaction, and Heartburn in Overweight and Obese Adults in the Omnicarb Randomized Clinical Trial. It was published in the May 28th, 2021 issue of the Journal of Nutrition. So go check it out. And thank you guys for listening today on the Living La Vida Low Carb Show. I love bringing studies to you guys, keeping you on the cutting edge of what is happening out there in the world of science and research. And you can keep up with everything that's happening in science and research. I do a show on Instagram, Jimmy Makes Science Simple. Go follow me over there at Jimmy Makes Science Simple. Sometimes I do short ones where I only read from the abstract because that's all I have access to, but I want to get that information out to you. And then sometimes I do these long form videos, which you've been hearing here on the Living La Vida Low Carb Show. But thanks so much for being here today, guys, and we'll be back again with another new study soon. We'll see you later.
Get inspiration from the Living La Vida Low Carb Show. Hey, thelivinglowcarbshow.com. Woo!
Hey guys, you know I'm all about healthy nutrition, and I have a brand new product I want to tell you about called Athletic Greens. This is not just a multivitamin. It has 75 essential elements that you want to have in your diet, from probiotics to greens to digestive enzymes to prebiotics. There's so many things that they pack into the Athletic Greens. The main reason why I love them is it puts it all in one place. Like literally you'd have to a la carte buy all of these different supplements, and they do it all in one package. So if you go to athleticgreens.com/Jimmy, and you can get a special discount if you go there, and the discount is you get a free 1-year supply of their vitamin D as well as some of their travel packs. Go check it out, you guys. athleticgreens.com/Jimmy.